There's an old saying in the West that the deadliest rattler is the one you don't hear. And in the dust-swept town of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1875, no one understood this better than the patrons of the Silver Dollar Saloon. That is, those who survived long enough to tell the tale of Michael Quick-Pour Harrison, the man whose steady hands could fill a whiskey glass as fast as they could empty a holster. They say you can learn a lot about a man by the way he tends bar, the way his eyes track trouble before it starts, how he holds himself when drunken cowboys get rowdy, and most importantly, what he does when steel comes sliding out of leather. But Michael Harrison didn't fit the usual mold of frontier bartenders. No scars marked his clean-shaven face, no brass knuckles adorned his delicate fingers, and his voice rarely rose above a whisper that somehow carried through the rowdiest Saturday nights. Peculiar sort? Marshall Wade Thompson would later write in his personal journal. The way he'd polish those glasses like he was handling precious gems, each one getting the same careful attention whether it was desert-stained or fresh from back east. Never seen hands that steady except maybe on a surgeon or a card sharp. Should have known right then something wasn't adding up. The marshal wasn't the only one who noticed something different about Harrison. Sarah Mackenzie, who ran the dry goods store across the street, often watched him through her window during the quiet morning hours. There was a grace to him, she'd tell her grandchildren years later. The kind you don't expect to find in a saloon. The way he moved, like every step was planned 3 moves ahead, reminded me of the way mountain lions stalk their prey, beautiful and terrifying all at once. But it wasn't Harrison's careful movements or his quiet demeanor that first caught people's attention when he arrived in Copper Creek that scorching June morning. It was the way he handled old Pete Murphy's welcome wagon. Pete, 3 sheets to the wind before noon as usual, had decided the stranger's fine eastern clothes made him an easy mark. "Hey, fancy boy," Pete had slurred, stumbling up to Harrison as he tied his horse outside the Silver Dollar. "Reckon you took a wrong turn somewhere. This here's a working man's town." Harrison had simply continued securing his saddlebags, his movements precise and unhurried. Those who witnessed the exchange would later swear they never saw him tense, never saw a single tell that would hint at what was coming. "I'm talking to you, dandy!" Pete had reached for Harrison's shoulder, a mistake that would become legendary in Copper Creek's history. What happened next was so quick that witnesses would argue about the details for years to come. Some swore Harrison had merely shifted his weight. Others insisted there was some fancy Eastern wrestling involved. What they all agreed on was that Pete somehow ended up face down in the dust, his arm bent at an angle that made the town's doctor wince just hearing about it. Harrison had helped Pete up with the same gentle care he'd later show to breaking glasses in his bar, even brushed off the old drunk's clothes. "No wrong turns," he'd said softly, his voice carrying that distinctive whisper that would become famous across the territory. "I'm exactly where I mean to be." Within a week, Harrison had bought the Silver Dollar from its previous owner, an aging Confederate veteran eager to return east. The purchase raised eyebrows, not just for the speed of the transaction, but for the stack of gold eagles Harrison had counted out with those precise, steady hands. Gold like that usually came with stories, and in the West, most of those stories involved smoking guns and fresh graves. But if Harrison had secrets, he kept them as quiet as everything else about himself. He transformed the Silver Dollar from a rough-and-tumble watering hole into something approaching respectability. The floors got swept daily, the windows washed until they sparkled, and the brass rail at the bar shone like a slice of sunset. "Man's got standards," Doc Wilson observed one quiet afternoon, watching Harrison meticulously arrange his bottles. "Question is, where's a man learn standards like that in a territory where most folks drink their whiskey from dirty jars?" The answer to that question would come soon enough, riding into town with the Hawkins gang, 5 of the meanest outlaws ever to plague the Arizona Territory. But that's another part of our story, one that would teach Copper Creek why some men don't need to raise their voices to be deadly, and why the quietest bartender in the West was about to become a legend. Before we dive deeper into this tale, folks, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because the story of Michael Quickpour Harrison is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The morning the Hawkins gang rode into Copper Creek was painted in shades of amber and gold, the kind of dawn that made even hardened men pause to admire its beauty. But beauty wasn't what brought Jake Hawkins and his boys to town. They'd heard whispers about a bank shipment coming through, the kind of whispers that could make cruel men rich and honest men dead. Marshal Thompson stood on his office porch, watching the 5 riders amble down Main Street. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but there was nothing casual about the way his eyes tracked their movement. Like watching wolves circle a flock, he'd later tell the territorial judge. You know blood's coming, just not where the first bite'll land. The Hawkins gang had earned their reputation the hard way. 3 bank robberies, 2 stage holdups, and enough dead lawmen to fill a small cemetery. Jake Hawkins, the oldest of the brothers, had a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to measure every man for a coffin. His younger brothers, Tim and Wesley, shared his dark hair and darker disposition. Their companions, a Mexican bandit called El Coyote and a former cavalry scout named Whitaker, rounded out a group that had terrorized 3 territories. They made their way to the Silver Dollar, as all newcomers did in Copper Creek. The saloon was empty save for Harrison, methodically preparing for the day ahead. He was arranging glasses with that peculiar precision of his when the bat-wing doors creaked open, spilling morning light across his polished floor. "Mighty fine establishment you got here," Jake Hawkins drawled, his spurs ringing against the floorboards. His brothers spread out, instinctively covering the room's angles. El Coyote lingered near the door, while Whitaker drifted toward the back exit. Man could get comfortable in a place like this. Harrison's hands never paused in their work. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" His whisper seemed to float across the bar like smoke. Tim Hawkins, the youngest and most volatile of the brothers, snorted. "Gentlemen? Hear that, Jake? Man thinks we're gentlemen." He ran a dirty finger along Harrison's pristine bar, deliberately leaving a streak. "Might be we're just 5 thirsty devils looking to wet our whistles." "Whiskey, then," Harrison replied, already reaching for a bottle. His movements were smooth, practiced, each pour measured perfectly without seeming to look. 5 glasses lined up like soldiers on parade. Wesley Hawkins lifted his glass, studying the amber liquid with exaggerated care. "Mighty fine service from such delicate hands. You always been a barkeep, mister?" "Those soft palms tell a different story." "Man's got a right to his stories," Harrison responded, resuming his glass polishing. "Just like he's got a right to drink in peace." Jake Hawkins's laugh was like rocks in a burial drum. "Peace? Oh, we're peaceful as lambs, ain't we, boys?" His hand dropped to his gun, an expensive Colt with notches carved deep in its pearl handle. Long as folks remember their place and keep their stories to themselves. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, but Harrison seemed not to notice. He simply moved down the bar, his cloth making slow circles on another glass. The morning sun caught the crystal, sending prisms dancing across the walls. "You know what I think?" Tim pushed away from the bar, his chair scraping loudly. "I think our friend here's hiding something. Man with hands that soft, manner that fine. Probably some banker who ran west with someone else's money." "Could be," Jake mused, his eyes never leaving Harrison. "Could be we ought to have ourselves a friendly conversation about that. What do you say, barkeep? Care to step out back and share your story?" But before Harrison could respond, Marshal Thompson's boots sounded on the boardwalk outside. The gang tensed, hands drifting toward weapons, but Jake waved them still. "Another time, friend," he said softly. "We'll be staying a spell. Plenty of time to get to know each other better." As the Outlaws filed out past the marshal, Harrison continued his work, seemingly unfazed. But Sarah Mackenzie, watching from her store window, would later swear she saw something change in his eyes. A flicker of steel beneath the surface, like lightning in a distant storm. The quiet bartender had recognized something in Jake Hawkins's voice, something that spoke of old graves and settled scores. The peace of Copper Creek was about to be tested, and only the man behind the bar knew just how far he'd go to preserve it. Word travels fast in a frontier town, especially when that word carries the weight of gunpowder and steel. By noon, everyone in Copper Creek knew about the morning's exchange at the Silver Dollar. More importantly, they knew the Hawkins gang wasn't just passing through. They'd taken rooms at Emma Bradley's boarding house, settling in like coyotes circling a wounded steer. Marshal Thompson spent the afternoon making his rounds, his weathered face betraying none of the concern churning in his gut. He'd seen towns like this before, watched them tear themselves apart when bad men decided to put down roots. But something about this felt different. The way Jake Hawkins had looked at Harrison, like a man trying to place a face from a wanted poster. "You might want to consider taking a vacation," Thompson told Harrison that afternoon, leaning against the bar while the bartender meticulously cleaned his glassware. "Weather's nice in California this time of year." Harrison's hands never stopped their precise movements. "Appreciate the concern, Marshal, but I've found running only leads to more running." Thompson studied him carefully. "Man who doesn't run usually has a reason to stand his ground or experience standing it." The ghost of a smile touched Harrison's lips. "Sometimes a man just likes where he's standing." Across the street, Sarah Mackenzie was having her own concerns. She'd seen the way Tim Hawkins watched her shop, his eyes lingering on the safe where she kept the week's earnings. More troubling was how Wesley Hawkins had spent an hour studying the bank's rear entrance, pretending to smoke while making mental notes. El Coyote and Whitaker had split up to work the saloons, buying drinks and loosening tongues. They were particularly interested in the stagecoach schedules and the habits of Copper Creek's more prosperous citizens. But they always circled back to the Silver Dollar, drawn by their leader's growing obsession with its quiet proprietor. As evening approached, Doc Wilson stopped by for his usual whiskey. The old physician had a talent for taking the temperature of a town's mood, and right now Copper Creek was burning with fever. "Heard an interesting thing today," he said casually, watching Harrison's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. "Fellow passed through from Prescott, said there was a lawman back east, fellow who'd cleaned up 3 counties before disappearing. Story goes he was as quiet as church mouse, but when trouble came calling, he was faster than chain lightning." Harrison poured another measure of whiskey with that same mechanical precision. "Lots of stories in the territories, Doc. Most ain't worth the breath used to tell them." "True enough," Wilson agreed. "But this one had a curious detail. Seems this lawman had a particular way about him. Handled his guns like they were fine crystal, kept everything around him just so, perfect-like." Before Harrison could respond, the bat-wing doors swung open again. Jake Hawkins strode in, followed by his brothers and El Coyote. The gang leader's eyes swept the room before settling on Harrison with predatory intensity. "Been asking around about you," Jake announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent saloon. "Funny thing is, nobody seems to know where you came from. Just appeared one day like a ghost." "Not much to know," Harrison replied, his whisper somehow filling the room. "Just a man making an honest living." Jake's laugh held no humor. "Honest? Now that's a word that can mean different things to different folks. Take my brothers and me. We're honest about what we are. Question is, are you?" The tension in the room drew tight as a hangman's rope. Doc Wilson's hand drifted toward the derringer he kept in his vest, but Harrison's slight headshake stopped him. "Only thing I'm being right now is a bartender," Harrison said softly. "And you gentlemen appear to need a drink." As he reached for the whiskey bottle, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a thin white scar circling his left wrist. Jake Hawkins's eyes locked onto it like a hawk spotting prey, and his cruel smile widened. It was the kind of scar a man got from manacles, from fighting against iron until flesh gave way. The game of secrets was about to take a deadly turn, and somewhere in Copper Creek's dusty streets, the ghost of violence stirred, waiting to see who would make the first fatal move. The next morning brought more than just sunrise to Copper Creek. It brought memories scratching at the door of Michael Harrison's carefully constructed peace. He stood in his small room above the Silver Dollar, methodically checking his reflection in a cracked mirror. The man staring back at him looked nothing like the one in the wanted posters that had once papered sheriff's offices across 3 states. assuming anyone was still looking. His fingers traced the scar on his wrist, a reminder of lessons learned in a Louisiana prison camp during the war. He'd been younger then, full of fire and foolish pride. The manacles had taught him patience, taught him that sometimes the quietest men were the ones you needed to watch most carefully. Down in the street, Tim Hawkins was making a spectacle of himself, harassing Emma Bradley as she tried to sweep her boarding house porch. The youngest Hawkins had woken with an appetite for trouble, the kind that often ended in wooden boxes and fresh graves. "Ain't right," Whitaker muttered from his corner table in the Silver Dollar, nursing an early morning whiskey. "Boy's gonna bring the law down on all of us." El Coyote just smiled, cleaning his nails with a knife that had seen too much use in dark alleys. The law? In this town? One old marshal and his green deputy? He spat on the floor, deliberately missing Harrison's freshly swept boards. "They're like rabbits facing wolves." Harrison's whisper drifted over like morning mist. "Might want to use the spittoon, friend. Hate to have to ask twice." The Mexican bandit's eyes narrowed, but something in Harrison's steady gaze made him reconsider his next move. He'd seen eyes like that before, in Sonora, on a federale who'd hunted him for 6 months straight. Man could shoot the flame off a match at 20 paces, never seemed to sleep, never lost the trail. Those eyes had followed him into his nightmares until he finally put a bullet in the lawman's back. "My apologies," El Coyote said carefully, using the spittoon this time. "A man should respect another man's place of business." Outside, Tim's voice rose to a shout. Emma Bradley's broom clattered to the boardwalk as the young outlaw grabbed her arm. Marshal Thompson was nowhere in sight, having ridden out at dawn to check on reports of suspicious riders in the hills. Harrison set down the glass he'd been polishing, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Every eye in the saloon tracked him as he moved toward the door, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. "Might want to let the lady be about her business," he said, his quiet voice carrying across the street with peculiar clarity. Tim Hawkins spun around, his hand dropping to his gun. "Well, if it ain't the delicate bartender, reckon you ought to stick to your glasses and leave men's business to men." Emma Bradley used the distraction to pull free, hurrying inside her boarding house. Harrison hadn't moved from the saloon's entrance, his hands hanging loose at his sides. But something in his stance made the morning crowd draw back, finding doorways and alleys from which to watch. "Only business, I see," Harrison replied softly. "Is a boy trying to prove he's grown by pushing women around?" Tim's face flushed red. "You calling me a boy?" His gun cleared leather with impressive speed, but somehow Harrison was already moving, his right hand a blur. Before anyone could blink, Tim's gun went spinning into the dust, his wrist caught in a grip that seemed gentle, but made the young outlaw's knees buckle. "Age isn't measured in years," Harrison whispered, close to Tim's ear. "It's measured in wisdom. Might want to work on yours." He released Tim just as Jake and Wesley Hawkins rounded the corner, drawn by the commotion. The young outlaw scrambled back, rubbing his wrist, his face a mixture of pain, rage, and something new. Fear. Jake took in the scene with calculating eyes. "Seems my little brother's been learning some manners," he said carefully. "Hope the lesson wasn't too expensive." "Education's free," Harrison replied, already turning back to his saloon. "Application's what costs." The morning crowd dispersed, but something had shifted in Copper Creek's atmosphere. They'd seen not just Harrison's speed, but the controlled power behind it. The quiet bartender had shown his hand, if only slightly, and Jake Hawkins's thoughtful frown suggested he was putting together pieces of a puzzle he'd seen before. By midday, the story of Harrison's encounter with Tim Hawkins had spread through Copper Creek like wildfire in dry grass. Each telling grew more elaborate, but one detail remained constant: the impossible speed of the bartender's hands. Doc Wilson, who'd witnessed the whole thing from his office window, spent the afternoon in deep conversation with Marshal Thompson after the lawman's return. "Reminded me of something I saw in Kansas City," the doctor mused, cleaning his spectacles with deliberate care. "Fellow named Martinez, fastest draw I'd ever seen. Until today. Thompson nodded slowly. Been thinking about a wanted poster I saw a few years back. Man called Silencer Mitchell. Earned his name by quieting troublemakers from St. Louis to Denver. Never raised his voice, never seemed to hurry. Just handled business with those quick hands of his. That poster mention any distinguishing marks? Wilson asked carefully. Like, maybe a scar on the left wrist? Before Thompson could answer, Sarah Mackenzie burst into the office, her usually calm demeanor shaken. Marshal, they're in my store. All of them. The Hawkins gang had indeed taken over Mackenzie's dry goods, not so much shopping as prowling. Jake lounged against the counter while his brothers rifled through merchandise. El Coyote stood watch at the door, and Whitaker examined the store's back entrance with professional interest. Fine establishment you got here, Miss Mackenzie, Jake called out as she returned. Reminds me of a place back in Missouri. Owner wasn't nearly as pretty, though. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Course, that place had some excitement. Safe got opened one night, mysterious-like. Sarah's hand drifted toward the derringer hidden in her skirts. My safe's not worth your trouble, Mr. Hawkins. Oh, we ain't here about your safe, ma'am, Wesley chimed in, holding up a bottle of hair tonic. Just admiring your stock, including that fine view of the Silver Dollar's back door. Across the street, Harrison watched the scene unfold through his saloon's windows. His hands moved automatically, polishing glasses, but his eyes never left the store. Something in his stance reminded Sarah of a mountain lion she'd once seen, perfectly still, yet coiled with deadly purpose. When Jake finally let his men out, Sarah hurried over to the Silver Dollar. She found Harrison meticulously arranging bottles, each label aligned with precision that seemed almost obsessive. They're planning something, she said without preamble. The way they were studying sight lines, checking exits. I've seen that kind of planning before during the war. Harrison's whisper was barely audible. We all got histories, Miss Mackenzie. Some just catch up sooner than others. That's what worries me, she replied. Jake Hawkins, he mentioned Missouri. There was a bank robbery there last year. 3 guards killed. The papers said it was professional work, military precision. She paused, studying Harrison's reflection in the bar mirror. Kind of precision a man might learn in a war. Harrison's hands stilled for just a moment. Lot of men learned things in the war they'd rather forget. And some men, came Jake Hawkins' voice from the doorway, learned things they put to good use. He strolled in, alone this time, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. Miss Mackenzie, might want to see to your store. These streets can be dangerous for a lady after dark. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah straightened her spine, nodded briefly to Harrison, and walked out with her head high. Jake watched her go, then turned back to the bartender with that predatory smile. You know what's funny? He said conversationally. Been trying to place you since we got here. Then little Tim's education this morning sparked a memory. Saw something like that once in a prison camp near Baton Rouge. Confederate guard quiet fellow moved like a cat. Taught me a few things about handling trouble without seeming to handle it at all. Harrison continued his work, but something had changed in the air between the two men. The quiet wasn't just silence anymore. It was the stillness before a storm. Memory's a tricky thing, Harrison whispered. Sometimes it's best left buried. Jake's laugh was cold as a grave. Oh, we're well past burying things, friend. Well past that indeed. The afternoon heat lay heavy over Copper Creek, but inside the Silver Dollar the air crackled with something far hotter than the Arizona sun. Jake Hawkins hadn't moved from his spot at the bar, his eyes fixed on Harrison like a rattler sizing up its prey. The saloon had emptied quickly, townsfolk sensing the storm brewing between these two men. Funny thing about that guard, Jake continued, running his finger along the bar's polished surface. Man could shoot the ace of spades at 50 paces, handle any troublemaker without breaking a sweat. Then one day he just disappeared. Same night, 3 prisoners escaped. His smile turned razor sharp. Same night the camp's strongbox went missing. Harrison's hands maintained their steady rhythm, carefully drying each glass. Some stories are better left in Louisiana. See, that's what's been bothering me. Jake leaned forward. Because that guard, he wasn't just good with his hands. He had a way about him. Everything just so everything in its place. Perfect like. He gestured to the meticulously arranged bottles behind the bar. Kinda perfect that makes a man remember, even years later. Outside, Marshal Thompson watched from his office window, sensing the growing tension. He'd sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office that morning, asking about both Harrison and the Hawkins gang. The reply had been troubling. Multiple jurisdictions interested. Stop approach with extreme caution. Stop armed and highly dangerous. Stop all of them. Stop. Back in the saloon, Jake was still talking, his voice casual but his eyes hard as flint. Those 3 prisoners? They went on to do quite well for themselves, pulled some impressive jobs. Always clean, always precise. Almost like they'd been trained by someone who knew about military precision. Man can learn bad habits anywhere, Harrison whispered, his voice carrying that same ethereal quality. Or good ones. True enough. Jake straightened up. But here's what really got me thinking. Last year, after that bank job in Missouri you heard Miss Mackenzie mention, someone started hunting us quietly, methodically. 3 of our old crew disappeared without a trace. All we ever found were their guns, laid out all neat and proper-like. A shadow passed over Harrison's face, quick as a cloud across the sun. Sounds like someone settling accounts. That's exactly what it sounds like, Jake agreed. And now here you are all the way out in Copper Creek running an honest business. He laughed softly. Almost had me fooled, too, until I saw how you handled Tim this morning. Some things a man can't unlearn, like the way he moves when death's on the line. Harrison finally looked up, meeting Jake's gaze in the bar mirror. Sometimes a man just wants peace. Peace? Jake's hand drifted toward his gun. No, what you want is redemption, to wash the blood off those perfect hands of yours. But see, those 3 prisoners you helped escape? They were McKinn. My brothers and me, we owe you for that night, for the training, for the escape. His voice hardened. And for vanishing with our share of that strongbox. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Harrison's hands had finally stilled, the glass and cloth set down with characteristic precision. I wondered if you'd recognize me, he said softly. Been a long time since Baton Rouge. Not long enough to forget, Jake replied. Way I see it, you got 2 choices. Option 1, you ride out of town tonight. We settle this another day. Option 2. His smile was cold as a desert night. Well, let's just say Copper Creek might need a new bartender by morning. Harrison's whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. There's always a 3rd option, Jake. You just never were good at seeing all the angles. Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the street in shades of blood red. Sarah Mackenzie, watching from her store window, saw Marshal Thompson quietly positioning deputies at strategic points around the Silver Dollar. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which man would make the first move in this deadly game of recognition and revenge. The Silver Dollar's batwing doors swung open, bringing with them a blast of hot air and Wesley Hawkins. The middle brother paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Jake and Harrison locked in their silent confrontation across the polished bar. Wesley's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Jake's slight headshake stopped him. Got company coming, Wesley reported, his eyes never leaving Harrison. Stage from Prescott, due within the hour. Carrying some mighty interesting cargo according to our friend at the depot. Jake's predatory smile widened. Well now, ain't that fortunate timing? Here we are, having this lovely reunion, and business opportunities just falling into our laps. Harrison's whisper cut through the air like a knife. Stage won't make it to town today. Marshall's got riders watching the road after those suspicious characters were spotted this morning. Always were quick on the uptake, Jake acknowledged. That's what made you such a good teacher. Speaking of teaching. He turned to Wesley. Get the boys. All of them. Reckon it's time we gave our friend here a proper education in frontier hospitality. Wesley backed out slowly, his spurs ringing on the wooden floor. Through the window, Harrison watched him cross the street to where Tim, El Coyote, and Whitaker were lounging in front of the general store. The four men exchanged words, then split up, moving with practiced efficiency toward different positions around the saloon. "You really want to do this, Jake?" Harrison asked, his voice somehow reaching every corner of the room. "In broad daylight, middle of town?" "Way I see it, we got reasons enough," Jake replied. "The strongbox, the dead friends, the months of looking over our shoulders. But mostly," his eyes hardened, "mostly it's about respect. You taught us everything we know about precision work, then tried to play both sides. That ain't right. Taught you too well, seems like." Harrison's hands moved across the bar, adjusting glasses with that same meticulous care. "All that attention to detail, all those perfect plans made you predictable." Jake's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Predictable? 5 of us, 1 of you. Simple mathematics." "Mathematics was never your strong suit," Harrison whispered. "You're right about one thing, though. I did teach you everything you know." His eyes met Jake's in the mirror. "But not everything I know." Outside, the town had gone quiet as a graveyard. Shopkeepers pulled their shutters, mothers called their children inside, and old-timers found comfortable spots to watch the drama unfold. Marshal Thompson and his deputies maintained their positions, but everyone knew this was between Harrison and his former pupils. Sarah Mackenzie, still watching from her store, saw something that others missed. Harrison's precise movements behind the bar weren't just his usual fastidious routine. He was positioning bottles, glasses, and that spotless mirror with tactical purpose. Every item placed just so, creating angles and reflections that gave him a complete view of the saloon and the street beyond. "You got one last chance," Jake said, pushing back from the bar. "For old time's sake, walk away, disappear again, we'll call it square." Harrison's soft reply seemed to echo with memories of distant thunder. "You know better, Jake. Some things need finishing proper." "Proper?" Jake's hand hovered near his gun. "Like those 3 boys we found last month? All laid out neat and clean, their guns cleaned and arranged just right?" "They chose their path," Harrison whispered. "Just like you're choosing now." The tension in the saloon stretched tight as piano wire. Outside, Wesley and the others had taken their positions. Tim by the livery stable, El Coyote behind a water trough, and Whitaker near the hotel's corner. They had every angle covered, every escape route blocked. But as Jake Hawkins looked into the eyes of his former mentor, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He'd seen that same calm look before, in the prison camp, right before Harrison had shown them what true speed looked like. The quiet bartender hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't raised his voice or shown any sign of concern. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek's main street, turning every doorway into a pool of darkness, and every window into a sheet of blazing gold. From his vantage point behind the bar, Harrison could see the subtle shifts in those shadows, marking where each member of the Hawkins gang had taken position. Doc Wilson, watching from his second-floor office, found himself counting heartbeats in the silence. The old physician had seen his share of shootouts, but something about this felt different. The usual pre-fight tension was there, but underneath it ran something deeper, a current of inevitability, like watching storm clouds gather over the desert. "You always did love your lessons, Harrison," Jake said, breaking the silence. "All those lectures about patience, precision, waiting for the perfect moment." He moved away from the bar with fluid grace, positioning himself near the entrance. "Reckon it's time we showed you how well we learned." Harrison's hands never stopped their methodical work, but now Sarah Mackenzie could see he was positioning specific bottles at precise angles, creating a complex network of reflections in the back bar mirror. "Teaching was never the problem, Jake. It's what you chose to do with the learning." "Chose?" Jake's laugh was bitter as raw whiskey. "You're the one who taught us about taking advantage of opportunities. That strong box was an opportunity. The bank in Missouri? Another opportunity. Even that stage coming in today, all just opportunities waiting to be seized. There's always a choice, Harrison whispered, like the choice you're making right now. Outside, Tim Hawkins was getting restless. The youngest brother had never mastered the patience his mentor had tried to instill. His hand kept drifting to his gun, fingers drumming against the pearl handle. Marshall Thompson, watching from the shadows of his office, recognized the signs. The boy was a pressure keg ready to blow, and in the game of gunfighting, the anxious ones usually moved first, and died first. Speaking of choices, Jake continued, his voice carrying clearly through the afternoon stillness. I've been wondering about something. Those 3 friends of ours we found last month, why'd you leave their guns cleaned and laid out so neat? Was that some kind of message? Harrison's whisper seemed to float on the heated air. Every man deserves a clean gun for his final fight. That's another lesson you seem to have forgotten. Wesley's voice carried from his position outside. Got movement on the street, Jake. Marshall's deputies are trying to circle around back. Let 'em, Jake replied, his eyes never leaving Harrison. Won't matter much soon anyway. He raised his voice slightly. Coyote Whitaker, make sure our law-abiding friends stay out of private business. Sarah Mackenzie, still watching from her store, saw Harrison's reflection smile slightly in the precisely arranged mirrors. In that moment, she understood something that had been nagging at her since morning. Every move the Hawkins gang had made, their positioning, their timing, even their choice of cover, had been predictable to a man who'd trained them. One last chance, for old time's sake, Harrison said softly. Walk away. Take your brothers and ride out. Some debts aren't worth collecting. Can't do that, Jake replied, his hand hovering near his gun. You know how it is. Reputation to maintain, lessons to finish. His smile turned cruel. Besides, way I hear it, that stage is carrying enough gold to make even an honest bartender consider retirement. Harrison's hands finally stilled, the last glass placed with perfect precision. In the mirror behind him, the complex arrangement of bottles and glasses had turned the back bar into a crystal surveillance system, showing every angle of the street outside. Then I reckon school's back in session, Harrison whispered, and something in his voice made Jake's smile fade. Time for the final exam. The tension in the air drew wire-tight as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything in shades of blood red and shadow black. In the street, Tim's fingers had stopped their nervous dance on his gun handle. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would make the first fatal move in this deadly reunion of teacher and students. Time has a way of stretching in moments before violence erupts, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. In those last seconds of peace, every detail burned itself into the memories of those watching. The way the setting sun painted Harrison's bottles in shades of fire, the soft creak of floorboards under Jake's boots, the distant call of a desert bird wondering why the town had gone so quiet. It was Tim who broke first, just as Harrison had known he would. The youngest Hawkins had never learned to master his nerves, and the waiting had wound him tight as a cheap pocket watch. He jerked his gun from its holster, the movement triggering a cascade of violence that would be talked about in Copper Creek for decades to come. Harrison moved like flowing water. Before Tim's gun cleared leather, the quiet bartender's hand had already found the sawed-off shotgun hidden beneath the bar, but he didn't raise it, not yet. Instead, he used his other hand to tip over a specific bottle on the counter, sending splashes of whiskey and shards of glass across the floor at Jake's feet. Jake, who'd started his own draw at his brother's movement, stumbled slightly on the sudden slick surface. His first shot went wide, splintering the bar where Harrison had been standing a heartbeat before, but Harrison wasn't there anymore. First lesson, Harrison's whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. Control the battlefield. El Coyote, seeing Tim's shot go wild, tried to angle his rifle through the window, but the complex array of bottles Harrison had arranged created a dazzling pattern of reflected sunlight, momentarily blinding him. His shot shattered 3 bottles but missed Harrison completely. Second lesson, the whisper continued. Use your environment. Wesley, always the smartest of the brothers, recognized the trap they'd walked into. "He's been setting this up all day," he shouted. "The bottles, the mirrors, even the damn sunlight." Harrison's movement was a blur. The shotgun roared, not aimed at any of the men, but at the hitching post outside. The wooden beam splintered, sending the horses into a panic. Their rearing and bucking forced Whitaker to dodge away from his carefully chosen position, right into Marshal Thompson's line of sight. "Drop it, Whitaker," Thompson ordered. The former cavalry scout, never the bravest of men, let his gun fall into the dust. Tim tried to compensate for his botched first shot, but his hands were shaking now. Harrison's voice drifted to him from the shadows of the bar. "Remember what I taught you about breathing, Tim? In through the nose, out through the mouth. Steady now." The younger man's next shot was better, but Harrison had already moved again, using the bar's mirrors to track every movement outside, while staying in constant motion himself. Jake, recovering his balance, fired twice more, his shots precise but always just behind his former mentor's position. "Getting slow, Jake," Harrison whispered. "Letting anger speed up your trigger finger." El Coyote, frustrated by the blinding reflections, tried to circle around to the saloon's side door. He made it 2 steps before a whiskey bottle exploded next to his head, sending him scrambling for cover. "Third lesson," Harrison's voice carried clearly despite its softness. "Never move without knowing your exit." The entire exchange had taken less than 30 seconds, but already the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Whitaker was in custody, El Coyote was pinned down, and Tim's nerve was clearly breaking. Wesley had taken cover behind a water trough, trying desperately to spot Harrison through the complex maze of reflections and shadows he'd created. Jake alone seemed to maintain his composure, though his face was twisted with rage. "Fancy tricks and clever words," he snarled. "That's all you ever had. But tricks run out, teacher. And there's still 4 of us to 1 of you." Harrison's quiet laugh seemed to drift through the smoky air like a ghost. "Count again, Jake. And remember the most important lesson of all." "Which is?" Jake demanded, his eyes darting from reflection to reflection, trying to locate the source of that whisper. "Always know what your opponent knows," Harrison replied softly. "And what he doesn't." The meaning behind Harrison's words became clear as a door opened above the saloon. Sarah Mackenzie stood on the second-floor balcony, her father's Civil War rifle trained steadily on the street below. At the same moment, Doc Wilson appeared at his office window, a scattergun glinting in the fading light. Even Emma Bradley had taken position, watching the back alley through a small hole in her boarding house wall, her dead husband's Sharps rifle at the ready. "You didn't think I spent all those months just serving drinks, did you?" Harrison's whisper carried a hint of amusement. "While you were watching me, I was teaching others, people who had something worth protecting." Jake's face twisted as the truth dawned. The quiet bartender hadn't just been preparing the saloon. He'd been preparing the whole town. Every citizen who could handle a weapon had been positioned and ready, watching and waiting while the Hawkins gang sprung their own trap. "Ain't just about speed," Harrison continued, his voice drifting through the smoky air. "Never was. It's about planning, about patience, about knowing your real strength." Tim, seeing movement in a window, fired wildly. The shot went wide, and before he could squeeze off another, a reply from Emma Bradley's rifle sent him diving behind a rain barrel, his gun spinning into the dust. "You taught us everything," Jake shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Every trick, every technique. We were your best students." "Taught you about guns," Harrison agreed softly. "About speed and skill. But you never learned the most important lesson." His whisper seemed to come from a new direction with each word. "A man's true strength isn't in his gun hand. It's in the people who stand with him." Wesley, trying to work his way around to the saloon's rear entrance, found his path blocked by 2 ranch hands he'd dismissed as simple cowboys. They held their rifles with the steady confidence of men who'd spent the last month practicing under Harrison's quiet instruction. El Coyote, still pinned down by the crossfire, cursed in Spanish. "This is impossible. He is just one man." "That's where you're wrong," Marshal Thompson called out, stepping into view with his deputy beside him. "He hasn't been one man since the day he decided to make this town his home." Jake, realizing how completely they'd been outmaneuvered, fired at a movement near the bar. The shot shattered a mirror, sending a cascade of reflections dancing across the room. But Harrison had already moved again, his actions so smooth they seemed almost casual. "Remember that night in the prison camp?" Harrison's voice floated through the chaos. "When I taught you about the importance of having a fallback position?" A bottle exploded near Jake's head, forcing him to duck. "About always knowing when you're beaten?" The sun had dropped below the horizon now, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. In that uncertain light, Harrison's carefully arranged bottles and mirrors created a maze of shadows and reflections that made it impossible to track his movements. "Last chance, Jake," the whisper came again. "For old time's sake, order your men to drop their guns, walk away while you still can." Jake's laugh held an edge of desperation. "Walk away? Like you did? Leave us to take the blame while you played honest citizen?" He fired again, the shot harmlessly embedding itself in the bar. "Number, if we're going down, I'm taking you with us." But even as he spoke, Wesley was laying his gun in the dirt, having finally recognized the futility of their position. El Coyote, seeing no option for escape, followed suit. Tim remained frozen behind his rain barrel, his earlier bravado replaced by wide-eyed fear. "Always were stubborn." Harrison's voice carried a note of what might have been regret. "Had to learn everything the hard way." Jake spun, trying to track the source of the voice, his gun hand trembling slightly. The setting sun caught the silver handle of his Colt, making it shine like fresh blood. "Show yourself," he roared. "Face me like a man." The whisper came from directly behind him. "Time for your final lesson." Jake Hawkins spun at the sound of Harrison's voice, his gun already moving. But even as he turned, he knew he'd made his final mistake. The quiet bartender stood less than 3 feet away, his Colt seeming to materialize in his hand as if by magic. The speed of the draw was beyond anything Jake had ever seen, even during those long-ago days in the prison camp. "You remember what I said about the perfect moment?" Harrison's whisper cut through the evening air. "About how you have to feel it in your bones?" Jake's gun hand froze halfway through its arc. He'd seen that look in Harrison's eyes before, on the night they'd escaped. It was the look of a man who'd already mapped out every possible move and countermove, who knew exactly how the next few seconds would unfold. "Your gun's got 5 shots left," Harrison continued softly. "The last one went into my bar." His own Colt remained rock steady, aimed at Jake's chest. "Even if you manage to get a shot off, there are 13 people currently aiming at you. Sarah's up high with that rifle of hers. Doc Wilson's got both barrels ready. And Marshal Thompson's deputy finally learned to handle that Walker Colt properly." From their various positions around the street, the townspeople maintained their aim, each one remembering the quiet lessons Harrison had given them over the past months. Hours spent practicing drawing and firing, learning to breathe properly to steady their hands. "You trained them," Jake said, realization dawning in his eyes. "All this time, while we were watching you, you were building an army." "Not an army," Harrison corrected gently. "A community. People willing to stand together against men like you. That's the lesson you never learned, Jake. The one I couldn't teach you in that prison camp." Wesley, still holding his surrendered position, called out to his brother. "It's over, Jake. He beat us before we even rode into town." But Jake's face had twisted into a mask of rage and wounded pride. "All that talk about precision, about patience. You're still just a traitor. Turned your back on your own students." "Students?" Harrison's whisper carried a rare edge of steel. "You were prisoners who learned a few tricks. Nothing more. The real lesson was about choice. Every man chooses his path." His eyes flickered to the scar on his wrist. "Even in chains, we choose who we become." The tension stretched like piano wire about to snap. Sarah Mackenzie, watching through her rifle sights, saw Jake's trigger finger twitch. Doc Wilson's hand tightened on his shotgun. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. "So what now, teacher?" Jake's voice dripped venom. "Going to kill me in front of all these fine citizens? Show them what their quiet bartender really is?" Harrison's reply was calm as ever. "That's another choice you get to make. Surrender. Face justice for what you've done, or—" He left the alternative hanging in the air. "Justice?" Jake barked a harsh laugh. "Like the justice you dealt out to our friends, all laid out neat and proper with their cleaned guns?" "They chose poorly," Harrison said softly. "Just like you're about to." He could see it in Jake's eyes, the decision crystallizing, the last vestiges of reason burning away in the face of wounded pride and shattered dreams. The outlaw's gun hand tensed, preparing for one final, futile attempt. "Jake, don't!" Wesley shouted, seeing the same signs. But Jake was beyond hearing. His gun hand started to rise, moving with all the speed and skill his old mentor had taught him years ago. In that moment, time seemed to stretch like molasses, the way it often does when death comes calling. Harrison's whisper floated through the frozen moment. "Some lessons can only be taught once." The sun's last rays caught the silver handles of both men's guns, turning them to fire as the final confrontation between teacher and student reached its inevitable conclusion. In the gathering dusk, Copper Creek was about to witness the ultimate lesson in speed, skill, and the price of choosing the wrong path. Time has a peculiar way of moving during a gunfight. Those who've survived such moments speak of how seconds stretch into eternities, how every detail burns itself into memory with terrible clarity. The witnesses to the showdown between Harrison and Jake Hawkins would later swear they could recall every instant, every movement, every breath of wind that stirred the dust in Copper Creek Street. Jake's draw was everything Harrison had taught him. Smooth, practiced, deadly fast. The gun cleared leather like greased lightning, the barrel rising with surgical precision. But even as the movement began, those watching knew it wouldn't be enough. Harrison's draw wasn't just fast, it was something beyond speed, beyond human limitation. Like watching a rattler strike, Doc Wilson would later write in his journal. No warning, no tell, just the pure poetry of death in motion. The report of Harrison's Colt came first, a sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. Jake's gun roared a split second later, but his shot went wild, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the saloon's wooden frame. He looked down in surprise at his gun hand, where blood bloomed from a neat hole through his wrist, the same spot where Harrison carried his old prison camp scar. "Final lesson," Harrison whispered, as Jake's gun clattered to the dirt. "The student never beats the teacher at his own game." Jake fell to his knees, cradling his wounded hand. The look he gave Harrison was a mixture of hatred, respect, and something like understanding. "Could have killed me," he managed through gritted teeth. "Could have?" Harrison agreed softly. "But some debts need paying in full measure, not just in blood." Marshal Thompson moved in quickly, his deputy covering the other gang members who remained in their surrendered positions. Wesley hadn't moved, his face a mask of resignation. Tim still huddled behind his rain barrel, all his youthful bravado washed away by the reality of true speed and skill. El Coyote, perhaps the wisest of them all, had already laced his fingers behind his head. "Territorial prison's going to be mighty interested in these boys," Thompson said, efficiently disarming Jake. "Especially given what happened in Missouri." Sarah Mackenzie lowered her rifle, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Around the street, other townspeople began emerging from their positions, each carrying the weapons Harrison had so carefully taught them to use. Emma Bradley's hands shook slightly as she set down her dead husband's rifle, but her eyes shone with pride. "You trained us well," she told Harrison as he passed her porch. "Just like you trained them. Difference is, we learned the right lessons." Harrison's ghost of a smile flickered in the gathering darkness. "The lessons are always the same. It's what people choose to do with them that matters." Doc Wilson, examining Jake's wound with professional detachment, couldn't help but notice its precise placement. "Clean through the tendons," he muttered. "He'll live, but he'll never draw fast again." That was the point, Harrison's whisper carried to them. Some men need to be stopped. Others just need to be slowed down enough to think about their choices. The townspeople began the work of securing the prisoners for transport. Wesley went quietly, pausing only to look back at his former mentor. "Should have listened better," he said simply. "Back in the camp when you talked about choosing the right path." Harrison nodded slightly. "Never too late to choose again, Wesley. Remember that in prison." As the evening settled over Copper Creek, the excitement began to fade into the stuff of legend. Already people were gathering at Emma Bradley's boarding house, eager to share their versions of what they'd seen. How the quiet bartender had outdrawn the notorious Jake Hawkins. How he'd transformed their town from helpless prey into a community capable of defending itself. But Harrison didn't join in the celebrations. He returned to his saloon, carefully righting the overturned bottles and sweeping up the broken glass. His movements were as precise as ever. Each item returned to its proper place with mechanical perfection. Sarah Mackenzie found him there, methodically cleaning the mirror that had helped save their lives. "You knew they'd come eventually, didn't you?" she asked. "That's why you stayed. Why you taught us all." Harrison's reflection showed that ghost of a smile again. "A man can run from his past, Miss Mackenzie, or he can prepare for it. I just chose to prepare. The aftermath of a gunfight has its own kind of quiet, different from the peace that came before. As night settled over Copper Creek, that new silence wrapped around the town like a familiar blanket. Marshal Thompson had the Hawkins gang secured in his jail, with extra deputies posted as guards. The story of their capture was already spreading across the territory, carried by telegraph wires and eager tongues. "Territorial marshals sending a special wagon," Thompson told Harrison, who was back at his usual position behind the bar. "Should be here within 2 days. Got telegrams from 3 different jurisdictions already, all wanting first crack at them." Harrison nodded slightly, his hands moving with their customary precision as he repaired the damage to his bar. "Missouri has the strongest case. Bank robbery, 3 dead guards." "And what about the other cases?" Thompson asked carefully. "The ones involving a certain prison camp escape? A missing strongbox?" The ghost of a smile touched Harrison's lips. "Statute of limitations ran out on those 2 years ago. Marshal in Louisiana confirmed it this morning." Thompson couldn't help but chuckle. "You really did think of everything, didn't you? Waited until the old crimes were clear before letting them find you." "A man learns patience in prison," Harrison whispered. "Learns to time things just right." Outside, the town was coming back to life. People emerged from their homes, gathering in small groups to share their parts in the day's events. Emma Bradley's boarding house had become an impromptu celebration hall, with Doc Wilson holding court, describing the incredible speed of Harrison's draw to an eager audience. Sarah Mackenzie sat at the bar, watching Harrison work. "They'll write songs about this, you know. The quiet bartender who outdrawn Jake Hawkins, the man who taught a town to fight back. People need their stories," Harrison replied softly. "Helps them make sense of things." "And what about your story?" she pressed. "The real one, about the prison guard who saw too much cruelty, who decided to teach inmates a different way, even if some of them chose to use those lessons wrongly." Harrison paused in his work, studying his reflection in the newly repaired mirror. "Some stories are better left in the past, Miss Mackenzie. Future's what matters now. But the past has a way of leaving marks, visible and invisible." Doc Wilson, examining Jake Hawkins's wound later that evening, noticed something telling. "The angle of the shot," he explained to Marshal Thompson. "It's identical to the scar on Harrison's wrist. Perfect symmetry, like a signature." In his cell, Jake seemed to have aged years and hours. "Should have known better," he told his brothers. "Man who can shoot like that, who can teach like that, he was never just a prison guard. Bet if you dig deep enough, you'll find he wore a badge once. Probably a famous one." Wesley, nursing his own regrets, nodded slowly. Remember those stories about that marshal out of Kansas? The one they called the teacher because he'd give every man a chance to surrender before he took them down? Disappeared about the same time Harrison showed up in that prison camp, Jake mused. Always did wonder about that. But Harrison himself offered no explanations. He simply continued his work, restoring his saloon to its pristine condition. Each bottle and glass returned to its precise position. The townspeople who came by noticed he'd kept some of the mirrors in their new positions, maintaining the tactical advantage they'd provided. "Expecting more trouble?" Emma Bradley asked, bringing him a fresh pie as a thank you. Harrison's whisper held a hint of amusement. "Trouble has a way of finding comfortable towns, Mrs. Bradley. Best to stay ready." And so Copper Creek began to settle into a new normal. The town had changed, not just in its ability to defend itself, but in the way people carried themselves. They'd stood together, fought together, and won together. They'd learned the quiet bartender's most important lesson, that true strength lies not in the speed of a draw, but in the bonds between people who choose to stand against darkness. The story was already growing in the telling, becoming the kind of legend that would be whispered around campfires and in saloons across the territory. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how little it changed Harrison himself. He remained as he had always been, quiet, precise, and ever watchful, a guardian whose most powerful weapon was not his lightning draw but his patience in teaching others to protect what they loved. Years later, folks passing through Copper Creek would often pause at the Silver Dollar Saloon, drawn by stories that had grown taller than the mountains framing the town. They'd order a drink from the quiet bartender, whose hands never seemed to slow with age, whose movements remained as precise as clockwork. Some would squint, trying to reconcile the peaceful man before them with the legends they'd heard. 5 men at once, they'd whisper. Fastest draw in the territory, but never killed unless he had to. Taught a whole town to stand up for itself. Harrison let the stories flow around him like water around a stone, neither confirming nor denying the increasingly colorful tales. The truth, as he well knew, was both simpler and more complex than the legends suggested. The Hawkins gang had faced justice in Missouri, their sentences handed down by a judge who'd known one of the murdered bank guards personally. Jake and his brothers received 20 years each, while El Coyote and Whitaker turned state's evidence for lighter sentences. But true to Harrison's intention, Jake's wounded hand ensured he'd never again be a threat with a gun. Marshal Thompson, who'd pieced together more of Harrison's past than most, kept his theories to himself. But occasionally, when the mood was right and the whiskey was flowing, he'd share a curious detail with Doc Wilson. "Found an old wanted poster," he'd say, from back in Kansas territory. "Shows a lawman they called the teacher. Picture's too faded to make out clearly, but the description mentions he had a peculiar way about him. Everything just so, everything in its place." The town itself had flourished in the years following the showdown. Harrison's lessons hadn't stopped with gunplay. He'd taught them about vigilance, about community, about the importance of standing together. Sarah Mackenzie expanded her store into a proper mercantile, while Emma Bradley's boarding house became a respectable hotel. Once a month, like clockwork, Harrison would gather any interested townspeople for practice behind the saloon. His whispered instructions carried the same patience they had years ago, teaching new arrivals the same lessons about speed, precision, and the responsibility that came with both. "Man's gotta have standards," he'd say softly, adjusting a shooter's stance with those precise hands. In everything he does. Some said he'd been a famous lawman before the war. Others claimed he'd been a Confederate cavalry officer. A few even whispered he'd been a spy, explaining his gift for seeing all angles of a situation. But if anyone ever came looking for him by another name, they found only a quiet bartender whose skills with a gun were matched by his skill at keeping secrets. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains in familiar shades of gold, Sarah Mackenzie finally asked the question that had lingered for years. "Why did you really stay?" she asked, watching him polish glasses with that same meticulous care. "After you dealt with the Hawkins gang, after all the old debts were settled, why here?" Harrison's reflection considered her in the mirror he'd used so effectively that fateful day. Sometimes, he whispered, a man finds exactly where he's meant to be, place where he can do the most good. He glanced out at the street, where new buildings had risen and old ones had been improved, where people walked with confidence, secure in the knowledge that they could protect what was theirs, where every citizen knew the value of patience, precision, and standing together. Besides, he added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, got the bar arranged just how I like it. The sun set on Copper Creek, painting the town in shades of amber and gold, just as it had that day when a quiet bartender had taught his final lesson to former students who'd chosen the wrong path. The Silver Dollar still stood, its windows gleaming, its mirror reflecting the peace of a town that had learned to defend itself. And behind the bar, Michael Harrison continued his work, his hands moving with the same precise grace that had made him legend. For in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in the speed of his draw or the accuracy of his aim, but in the legacy he'd built. A legacy measured not in notches on a gun, but in the strength of a community that had learned to stand together against whatever darkness might come calling. Before we wrap up this tale, my friends, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because there are more stories coming about the legends of the Old West, about the quiet heroes who shaped our history one whispered lesson at a time.